law. So Kadis courts can be seen as an example of different types of adjudication. Sharia law falls into that category, common law. And so the way you sometimes understand common law, well, this is probably something that we shouldn't talk about, but think about how people get married. So people can go to, have a wedding or go to like a civil registrar, city registrars do those kinds of things. But also in certain jurisdictions, if you live with someone for 6 months, for all intents and purposes, you are married to them. And so this is an example of common law interpretation of what marriage would be. And so in fact, sometimes common law is all that people often resort to. So, for example, in a country like Kenya, most people don't have marriage certificates, but it's rare to sort of argue that, like, if you've been in someone's compound for like 10 years, common law suggests that you are legally married. Now, civil law is also used to adjudicate civil injuries. And so, again, the question of whether it's criminal law or civil law. Now, there are also other mechanisms of solving disputes, so you don't have to always sue people. Dispute resolution or arbitration. So, for example, a lot of employers will say, don't sue us, let's talk about this and settle this. So this is an example of dispute resolution. Now, the next thing that we shall be talking about is, I think, constitutions. So we are looking at political institutions, institutional arrangements, so things like parliamentary, presidential, and other executive types of powers. Different types of political systems, unitary, confederal, and other types of systems. And so if you sort of think about the past maybe 35 years since the end of communism, there has been a move to try and change regimes into democratic systems of government. How successful we have been, that's an interesting question. So, for example, think about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially. Well, actually, especially in Iraq. And the US invaded Iraq in 2003. I don't know if you were even born. No? Ooh, that's that's history. So the reason for the invasion, as the U.S. government detailed, was because Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Now, of course, this was the second invasion. The first invasion was in 1990, after Iraq took over or invaded Kuwait. And so it's almost like the 1990-91 war wasn't finished. And so Saddam was prohibited from doing certain things, including having weapons of mass destruction, which it was said he did have, which is why the US went in 2001, in 2003, to try and take out those weapons of mass destruction. Now, it later emerged that that wasn't necessarily true. There weren't weapons of mass destruction in that kind of way, in the way the US government actually suggested. And so then the question was, so it was almost like the government was looking for a justification for the invasion of Iraq. And so the US said, well, this guy murders like a whole bunch of people, so maybe we should kick him out of power anyway. And so the US tries to create a democracy in Iraq, which is an example of a regime. We'll be talking about regimes a lot. And so, for example, democracy is one example of regimes. Now, what the US, I think, did not know, and I'm going to skip a couple of slides here, is that some countries Some countries are not. It's interesting the way the U.S. society is created. Because people share certain understandings. For example, you vote, if you win, you form government. If you don't, you form the opposition. People vote based on interests, beliefs, socialization that we talked about. In other places, voting is because of other considerations. Now, in 1994, there was one of the worst genocides in modern history in Rwanda. You have probably heard of it. And if you ask yourself, or if you read about it, why did the genocide happen? It was an ethnic situation that dated way back to colonialism. And so, for example, in that situation, the Tutsis, who are the minority, formed the government. The Hutus, who are the majority, were generally excluded from many things like government, the military. And so the ethnic identity in certain societies is the most important part. And so the US belatedly realized that Iraq had ethnic and or religious factions. And so, for example, the Shias, which is a religious sect, um, form about 60% of Iraqi society. The Sunnis form about 20%, or maybe about 25%. And the Kurds, we have talked about the Kurds, form about 15% of the Iraqi population. Now, so you will see that I have mentioned both religion and ethnicity. So, for example, most Sunnis and Shias are Arabs, but they are religiously divided. The Kurds are majority Sunni, um, and so, for the most part, the Sunnis were in charge. And so the US is like, oh, we can bring democracy to Iraq. And then when voting starts, people are voting based on religion or ethnicity. And so, in fact, the US had to organize what is called managed democracy. So, in most countries, democracy is like whoever wins is the leader. In Iraq, it was like where we have to organize this. And so, even today, the prime minister of Iraq is usually a Shia. The president, they have a prime minister and a president. The president is usually either a Sunni or a Kurd. And then the Speaker of Parliament, those are the three most powerful positions, is either a Kurd or a Sunni. The prime minister is always a Shia. The president and speaker of the parliament can be one of those two other groups. And so we find that sometimes ethnicity is more important than any other considerations. And so what the US thought it was going to do kind of really did not happen. Some of these regimes are really, really weak. Now, but people still take voting seriously, and they are proud to take part in voting. There's a very odd practice that happens in other countries, not in this one. So when you vote, you dip your finger in ink. It's usually indelible, and so you can't basically vote again because you already voted. Now you would think that there might be maybe better systems. Also, I don't know if the little girl was able to vote. Uh, so voting is generally mostly for over 18s. But so again, sort of think about regimes and the kind of the different types of regimes and sort of who decides what kind of regime you can have. So, for example, in Iraq, they had to create a new constitution. Lots of countries actually throw out their old constitutions, unlike the United States. For example, in Kenya, we threw out our old constitution and created a new one in 2010 that was said to be the most progressive. I don't know. Syria, the country that is known as Syria, is in the process of creating a new constitution. Now, of course, people retain some of their old things in the constitutions, but it's important to think about constitutions as the basis of how politics is organized, both here and so, for example, when we talk about adjudication of issues, when the president says birthright citizenship, that is something that is part of the United States Constitution, the 14th Amendment. And so you will hear a lot of references to the Constitution, what the Constitution allows, how to amend the Constitution. And so, some people ask, for example, should the United States be ruled through a constitution that was established 220, almost 50 years ago? Is that like, are things still the same? Or should a new constitution for the modern times be created? Now, some people will also say, well, maybe we should be like the British who don't have a constitution. And so part of my question is, how do they even know what's right and what's wrong? They have a set of like basic laws, like they just know. But for most political systems, constitutions decide who does what, when, how. So government activities, allocation, form of power relationships. So for example, and again, please pay attention to the foolishness that's going on in this country. The Constitution of the United States set out the conditions for the formation of the post office. So the post office, the United States Post Office, is in the Constitution. This gentleman who owns Tesla wants to sell off the post office. Can he? Seems to me like you might need a constitutional amendment to either take out the post office from the Constitution or maybe to allow for it to be sold. Now, again, this is the challenge of constitutions and modernity. Is the post office a relevant thing? Should it be in a constitution? I will tell you this from living in a country where people don't have addresses. So like if you're telling someone where to find you, you will use like random things like, there's a tree, there's a school, there's this, there's that. Really unhelpful ways of telling addresses. So from that perspective, the post office is a really, really creative invention. But is it relevant for the 21st century? But again, can we just sell it? Or because it's in the Constitution, we need to figure out a way to deal with the post office. So these are some of the limitations of the powers of rulers that we're talking about. Even though, so for example, think about maybe the 25th, was it the 25th Amendment that governs term limits? Why was the 25th Amendment necessary? So FDR, George Washington served 2 terms and established a precedent. It wasn't in the rules. And then FDR comes in and he's like, well, there's no rule against it, so I'm going to run for 4 terms. And so he served, 3 terms and some change, but he was elected 4 times. And so then the question was, should we have rulers who do that kind of thing? Should we be like Cameroon, which has had the same president since 1982? And so the US public was like, well, maybe that's a terrible idea. And so the 25th Amendment on the appointment or the term limits and how to remove a president if they are not able to perform their duties was drafted. So this is a limit on the power of rulers. Form of power relationships. Right now, there's another debate that is going on, and it's interesting. It's an interesting time to be alive and to be a political scientist. This a petition that is going around that suggests the current president should be able to serve a third term. Now, the question is, if that is the case, can former presidents serve a third term? Now, the way this petition is drafted, apparently not. So it specifically excludes Obama, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. And so is that a law that can pass? Because you need a constitutional amendment to change term limits. Is that something that, now, part of the beauty of the United States is that it's very difficult to do those kinds of things. Because for a constitutional amendment to pass, it has to be voted on by Congress, 2/3 majority, but also be passed by 3/4 of legislatures. 3/4 is 30 something, maybe 38. And so, because, for example, Democrats control about 22 legislatures, that's probably not going to happen. And so sometimes the ability to limit the power of rulers as our worst impulses is a good thing. Now, constitutions are changeable, including the United States one, and that is the procedures we've mentioned. In other places, it's sort of like, well, let's just change the constitution and add something or take out something or throw the whole thing and start from scratch. And especially if you had a constitution like the one that was in Syria, you probably want to throw it out and create a more equitable society. The theory is that constitutional regimes operate under the rule of law, but again, sometimes they break the law, and then you have to have adjudication of courts to figure out what is going on. So this is why we're saying interpretation or disagreements over interpretation can occur. Some rulers can bend the rules to serve their personal agenda or get their people to bend the rules. And so sometimes it's not, the rule of, even what we call the rule of law can be violated. Now, so when we think about the different types of regimes, this is a bit of a spectrum. So if you have no government, and this is the case in like parts of Somalia outside the capital, parts of Libya, parts of Afghanistan, that is what we call anarchy. But anarchy is not necessarily a form of government. If you have seen the movie Purge, that would probably be an example of anarchy. Now, the rule of one is either a monarchy or a dictatorship. So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, they have a king. In Brunei Darussalam, they have a king. And so this is the head of government. But also if you have a regime like, say, maybe Venezuela, where the rule of one, even though they were elected democratically, like that's the person who... Now, there are questions over whether this country is trending in that direction, in the rule of one. Now, the rule of a few is an oligarchy. Bernie Sanders has been talking about oligarchy since like 1993. Now, if you look at the people who attended the inauguration of this current president, or if you look at his cabinet, you might think that it's an oligarchy. People who are super wealthy, people who can almost buy the presidency and then dismantle the government. So these are the oligarchs. This is oligarchy. Russia is an example of an oligarchy. The really rich people are the ones who make decisions. Now, if it's the rule of a few that is the military, then it's a junta. An example is Myanmar. So Myanmar is ruled by a military government, even though they have like presidents. But the leader of the military is more powerful than the president. And so military regimes are generally juntas. Another example of a current junta is in Chad. Chad is next to Egypt and Libya. And so the military leader, I think maybe even Burkina Faso or Mali or one of those countries. So military leaders. Now, democracies are, this is another example, but we should know that there are about 500 different types of regimes. For example, we do not include kleptocracies. Kleptocracies are governments ruled by thieves. I am not sure which ones those are, but yeah, this like 500 different types of regimes. So there's direct democracy and representative democracy. Most places have representative democracy. Direct democracy would be found in a place like Switzerland. Switzerland votes for nearly everything. They are actually super tired of voting. So if you want to build a road, you call a referendum. You have to have at least 50,000 people participate. And so the Swiss keep voting on a whole bunch of things. Now, is that necessarily effective? Imagine if, for example, the US people had direct democracy, but the question is that maybe